really good to be with you all. It's quite a privilege to be able to be here and speak with you and share some of the things we've been doing at ATS. As I was preparing to talk to you DMin directors, I recalled an experience I had when I was academic dean at North Park Seminary in Chicago related to our DMin program. Paul Bramer was on the faculty at that time. I don't know if he even knows this story, but we'll see. We had a joint DMin program that we did with some of the other Chicago schools, theological schools. And we had recruited some students from overseas. That's all I'll say. I won't be any more specific about it. But there was one of the students who had a great time of difficulty keeping up with his bill. And eventually it got to the point that we told him, just don't come back for this next round of classes until you can get your bill up to date. Well, you can see where this is going. He came, regardless. And it turned out that he told his story to his classmates, and they took up an offering for him, kind of solicited donations from them to help cover the cost. So they took up all this money, ended up getting a few $100s to help pay his bill. And one of our faculty was teaching that night when they took up the collection. They handed him an envelope full of cash. And so as academic dean, he wanted to be accountable to me, and so called me up. This is after dark. And my memory is sitting in a car with Paul Koptak under a street light in Chicago, counting an envelope full of cash. It felt like a drug deal or something, but we both wanted to be accountable for this money and be very careful with it. Well, hopefully none of you have had any experiences, anything remotely like that in your work as directors of DMin programs. The mission of ATS is to promote the improvement and enhancement of theological schools to the benefit of communities of faith and the broader public. The work that we do on behalf of the schools, or that the association does, it's actually you. We're the staff who support it, but the work that the association does is ultimately about improvement and enhancement of theological schools, not just for their benefit, but for the benefit of communities of faith, and then the broader publics, the world that we serve. The association is two separate corporations. This happened in about 2004. There are two corporations that work closely together: an association of theological schools that provides a host of programs, services, research, and so forth, and I'll say much more about that, and then a commission on accrediting, which does the work, obviously as the name says, of accreditation of schools. The Commission on Accrediting has 245 member accredited schools, 5 director staff, 1 full-time support staff, and its work is done through a board of commissioners, a group of people, representatives from our schools, who are elected by the membership at the biennial meetings and who serve as the people who make decisions about accrediting issues that come up within the membership. As you know, many of you may have been involved in the process. The standards of accreditation were last revised and approved by the biennial meetings of 2010 and 2012. So they are your standards. Sometimes people talk about accrediting or ATS as if it's the group of us who happen to work in Pittsburgh. But actually we're there to support the work you do. They're your standards, it's your association, and we work to support that. The association has 271 members. It includes all the accredited schools, but also schools who are on their way toward accreditation, associate members and then candidate members, to make a total of 271. So the process of accreditation begins with membership in the association and then moves through a process toward accreditation and joining the Commission on Accrediting as well. If you have any questions or observations you'd like to make as I go through, please stop me, raise your hand. Any questions about this structure before we go on? We all work in the same building. We do talk to one another fairly regularly, and collaborate on our work, but there are two pretty clear areas of work: accreditation and then the work of the association in programs and services.
Membership fees by the schools the same across the board?
Yeah, the membership dues are based on the school's expenses, so that's how the calculation's made. The great majority of the dues go to support accreditation. So that side of the building is supported by dues and also some fees that are paid. Fees, for example, for petitions or for accreditation visits. There are some fees associated with that. But that side of the work is supported by your dues. The programs and services side, where I work, and which I'll talk about most this evening, and which this project fits, is most largely funded by grants. Specifically from Lilly Endowment and the Henry Luce Foundation. And also the schools pay certain fees to attend leadership education or other kinds of events. So the dues support the accreditation side. Basically grants and registration fees support the programs and services side. Any other questions? Okay. The association has 4 key values. And I wanted to run through these fairly quickly to give you an idea of the things that guide the work of the staff and also the work with the whole association. First of all, diversity. Different expressions of faith represented by the member schools, represented in this room, represented in almost all the things that we do at ATS. When the boards are elected, the Board of Commissioners and the ATS board, one of the things we attend to through the nominating process is getting representation from the broad variety of schools in the association. Across ecclesial families, we talk about evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Orthodox, sizes of schools, types of schools, US and Canada. We want to have broad diversities, men and women on the boards, racial, ethnic diversities. So we attend to all of those things in doing the work of the association. What I want to emphasize here is that every school's mission and theological tradition are privileged. And it's the work of the association to help your school fulfill its distinctive mission as effective as possible. So no matter what your theological stance or mission, the work of the association is to support that mission and help you to become the best school you can be given your particular mission and theological stance. Another key value is quality and improvement. The whole work of ATS, including both the accrediting and programs side, have been described as aspirational, seeking to help the schools become the best they can be. The work of accreditation, for example, is more aspirational than it is compliance-based. Some of the regional accreditors are very much driven by compliance. ATS accreditation is more aspirational. That is, we want your school to become the very best that it can be. And to be honest, in the standards of accreditation, there are a number of shall statements. The school shall. And there are compliance issues. But the spirit of the work of accreditation is aspiration. It's not the cops, but it's the people trying to help you become the best you can be. And that spirit pervades the whole organization, both commission and the board of ATS. Another key value is collegiality. One of the things we emphasize, and I'll say more about this related to the Educational Models Project, is that much of the expertise for doing the work of theological education is in the schools. And we believe that bringing people together to work together and share their experiences, regardless of the type of school they come from or the size or the ecclesial family, bringing people together to do that work together is much more effective than any school could do it alone. ATS has been called one of the most remarkably effective ecumenical organizations in North America, and I think that's true. It's a remarkable gathering of people across theological boundaries that really doesn't happen many other places, if any. A final key value is leadership. Much of what I talk about as we go forward will be in the category of leadership education. We believe schools are stronger if they have effective leadership, and this comes from faculty, it comes from administrators, it comes from staff. But that is an emphasis of the association on leadership. And coming out of that, we believe that your schools do their missions most effectively when they are preparing effective leaders for communities of faith and other ministries. So ours is leadership development work to help you do your leadership development work. This thing that became ATS began in 1918 as a conference of theological seminaries, basically out of concern for quality and effectiveness in theological schools. In 1936, it became the American Association of Theological Schools and took on an accrediting function. In 1938, the first list of accredited schools, 37 schools, was published by the American Association of Theological Schools. In the 1880s and 90s, the association began to focus on leadership education for theological educators. And then in the year 2000, so just 15, 16 years ago, we began a regular program, ATS began a regular program of leadership education with 6 administrator groups: presidents, academic deans, financial officers, development officers, student services personnel, and technology officers. And that's been going on ever since. So programs and services in ATS, this part of the organization that is in my portfolio, does leadership education for administrators and faculty. It does research, just a taste of which I will show you. And this is a growing emphasis of ATS, to do research and analysis of all the data that you submit to us every year, for example, in your annual report forms, as well as information that we're gathering through the projects that I'll be talking about in just a minute. We have student data instruments. Some of your schools utilize the entering student questionnaire, graduating student questionnaire, the alumni questionnaire, as well as the profiles of ministry instrument. And then initiatives. These are the special projects in theological education that we oversee that deal with particular issues in theological education to help the schools become better at what they're doing, to answer puzzling questions about trends in theological education, to think about how this industry, if you will, or this work needs to become more effective. So among the initiatives, I've named 4 here. There have been other projects that I'll not talk about, but very quickly, if you can read these, this one is the Committee on Race and Ethnicity, the association's work with racial ethnic faculty and administrators. The Women in Leadership work, so helping both women, faculty and administrators become better at what they do. And then these 2 major projects that we're working on now, the Economic Challenges Facing Future Ministers, which is the project that some of your schools are involved in. Lilly Endowment has given some large grants to schools to work on issues of student financial literacy, student debt, and the financing of theological education. We're coordinating that project for Lilly Endowment. And then the large one that I'll talk about in a few minutes, the Educational Models and Practices in Theological Education project. Any questions before we shift gears just a bit? Okay. One of the things, and I'll just mention 2 or 3 different things that I'm sure are familiar to you, but just to highlight why we believed it was important to engage educational models and practices. Changes in society, changes in the church, changes in the students that you're serving, so a whole host of changes, including changes in higher education that you've been experiencing in your places and that demand re-evaluation of the way we do our work in theological education. This is from religious landscape studies done by the Pew Foundation. These have to do with the United States, so apologies to those of you in Canada, but I think some of the trends are similar. What this shows is self-reported religious adherence. And between 2007 and 2014, the changes in the percentages of people who self-identified with these particular groups in the United States. So evangelical Protestants went from, according to these self-reports, went from 26% of the population down to 25%. Roman Catholics from about 24% down to 21%. Mainline Protestants from 18% down to about 15%. And then the unaffiliated, or sometimes in other surveys are spoken of as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, jumped from 16% to 23%. All of these surveys can be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, but one source that I trust more than many is a sociologist named Mark Chaves, who's done a number of studies of religion, especially in the United States. Chaves remains wary of doomsday predictions, but he does conclude that no indicator of traditional religious belief or practice is going up in North American populations. And he notes, if there is a trend, it is toward less religion. If that's the case in the communities of faith that we serve, it has a direct impact, obviously, on the work that you do and the work that your schools do. Chaves concludes that the changes that he is observing, this downward trend, those changes are not due to episodic factors, but to long-term, largely demographic forces that have shaped and will continue to shape American religion more profoundly than the latest religious scandal, conflict, or innovation. So these are bigger than just episodic downturns because of a certain scandal or problem, but they are long-term downward trends that are forced by demographics and a number of other things. And I think it's probably the case that these trends are happening in Canadian religious adherence perhaps even more rapidly than in US. Any reflections on this before we go on?
Not a reflection, but a question.
Sure.
Could you spell that last name of that?
Chaves, C-H-A-V-E-S. Mark Chaves. And his book is called American Religion, Contemporary Trends. It's a Princeton University Press publication, 2011. It's a rather slim book, but it's full of really solid information, helpful. Now a few slides about enrollment. General slides, Tom will go into much more detail tomorrow or the next day, I believe it is. This chart shows two different things. They're somewhat unrelated, but the connection is an interesting one. The blue line shows the growth of expenses across ATS schools. In 2005, a little over $1.4 billion in expenses, going up to over 1.8 in 2015. So getting close to 1.9. So the upward line of increases in expenses. That's not a surprise to anyone. The red line represents decreases in full-time equivalent student numbers. That line is a bit more dramatic than the headcount numbers would be, because full-time equivalent is declining a little more rapidly than the headcount numbers have been declining. Now, Tom will give some more analysis of those numbers, and certain degree programs are increasing, others are decreasing. But just to give you an idea of the tension that this is creating within our schools, the schools are serving fewer FTEs, but expenses continue to go up. This is overall enrollment. That arrow shows the peak in enrollment. What it shows is overall in the last decade, there's been a decline in total headcount enrollment across ATS schools. In 2015, some preliminary possible good news, I qualify that in many, many ways. There is a bit of an uptick in total headcount enrollment, and I think Tom will say more about that as well.
What year was the peak?
The peak was about 2006, 5 or 6. And the total headcount enrollment at that time was a little over 80,000. And now it's down to about 73, I think, 72. This one shows the Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry headcount enrollment across ATS schools going all the way back to 1988. So it's a lengthy span of time. But you can see the two trends that are happening. Master of Divinity enrollment continues to decline, and the DMin enrollment for the past number of years has been relatively flat. Yes, Paul?
And Steve, just given that I'm not sure what the typical is, but say 15 years after the MDiv might be an average when they come into the DMin program. So we're really having to look at wherever the MDiv is now, in 15 years, that may be reflected in the DMin. In other words, we haven't maybe experienced the decline that the MDiv has been experiencing. We'll start to fairly soon, I would think.
If the MDiv is the primary feeder for DMin, then there'll be a lag, and that should be reflected in one way or another, which raises questions about admission criteria. And I'll say a little more about that.
Do we have stats for the 15-year gap?
Oh, no, I was guessing.
I would have said it's half that at least.
For your school and for our school, it's about 20 years. So that's a stat that we don't have. The question is how long after a person completes MDiv do they enroll in a DMin on average? I don't think we have that.
No. Yeah, I don't know if that.
That'd be interesting if there's a way to get at that. I don't know if y'all have the research data that could get at that. I think it's an interesting insight, Paul, as to how all of us have an anecdotal model of what a typical DMin student looks like with age plus experience, but what does that look like across the board?
Yeah, I don't think we collect data that would be able to sort that way.
There's a couple factors that might mitigate against that, and we'll talk about those tomorrow.
Okay, fine.
Good. Yes, please.
Question would be interesting with the decrease in the MDiv. If has there been any study then in what the percentages in a DMin program now, schools, have they seen an increase in MDiv equivalence students coming in? And that's what's making up the steady DMin,
Okay, propping it up as it is now.
It'd be interesting to see if that percentage has shifted over time.
Yeah, good question. Yes, Larry.
I don't know if we could ever gather this data, but I'd be interested to know, particularly with DMin, what target numbers are and how we're doing it against our targets, as opposed to just straight enrollment. Do you follow my question?
Each school's own admission target that they've set up.
We actually would like to take in and graduate a number equal to the faculty, so that each year we're, in theory, one faculty per student graduating. So I don't know if other programs try to set those limits or that type of thing, but it'd be interesting to compare the enrollment trend versus the targets that are being sought.
No. Good.
There is an DMin peer group that's doing research.
Yeah, there is.
We'll get to that in just a moment, actually. Don't you steal my thunder. Just a couple of other things. This is the headcount enrollment by ecclesial family. I think you saw a chart like this, those of you who saw Dan Ailshire's presentation last year. So this is the same thing. I bet his enrollment slide didn't go funky like mine did, though. Just updated for 2015 with the changes by ecclesial family. So the challenge that we face with that very, very brief sketch of some of the issues: increasingly financially stressed schools, providing an ever wider range of educational programs in an ever increasing range of formats for a slowly declining number of students. Is there anyone for whom that is not the case? Tell us the secret formula. And the challenges are large and significant, and I never want to soft pedal those. They're similar to challenges that theological schools have faced for decades. But it seems that the scope and number of the challenges and the pace of change are truly unprecedented. To help the schools address those challenges and also take advantage of opportunities. I think it's too easy to get hung up on the challenges, and you hear a lot of rhetoric about the crisis in theological education. And I don't want to diminish the challenges that are there, but I also do want to look at the resources that are present to address these challenges and also see the opportunities that lie before us as well. In order to help the schools with those things, we've embarked on the largest project that the association has ever taken on, and it's this Educational Models and Practices project. The project, and I put the brochure in front of you, you can look at that if you'd like. It seeks to explore current and developing educational models and practices among member schools. What are the schools doing? Let's see if we can find out. We know that there's a lot going on. We've known that for a long time, and that almost every school is working very hard to address some of these challenges and take advantage of opportunities. So we want to explore those. We also want to assess their effectiveness in educating and forming students for ministries in communities of faith and the larger world for service in the 21st century. Schools are doing a lot of things. There are a lot of possible ways of doing this. What are the truly effective ways? What are the ways that are financially sustainable? We could come up with the most elegant and effective plan of educating, but if it's not financially sustainable, then we've wasted some time and laid even more debt, perhaps, on the backs of students. So we want to assess effectiveness. We also want to affirm the effective educational models and practices by incorporating them into the character and work of the association and the commission, including, as appropriate, embedding them in the standards of accreditation. It's an enormous task, but if we all work together, I think we can make some pretty significant strides toward addressing those challenges and embracing the opportunities. Well, what do we mean by educational models and practices? We're using that phrase with a very broad definition, including such things as educational goals. Traditionally, our schools have prepared leaders to serve in congregations, often as solo pastors or members of pastoral staffs. Often people who've been nurtured and sent by an ecology of denominational organizations. Many of those pathways are no longer there. For many schools, this is no longer the case. They're preparing as many people for non-congregational service as for congregational service. So do the schools have the right goals and the right mission? Some maybe need to rethink the mission that they have. Or the assumption that certain forms of theological education are the best way to prepare congregational leaders. Some of them involving separating the learner from contexts of ministry, at least for a period of time. Are the schools using the right models and practices? So educational goals, educational program design. Are we going about this the right way, the most efficient way, the most formative way? Are the curricula the right shape, the right size? One of the peer groups that I'll talk about in just a moment is working on those schools that have decreased their Master of Divinity degree from in the 90s or 80s of credits, semester credits, down to 72 or 75. What does that do for curriculum? And we'll be asking that question in that group. Is that a sufficient amount of credits or time, or even those the right questions to be asking? Assumptions about faculty work, faculty workload, faculty responsibilities, faculty expertise. One of the interesting things that we have discovered in some of our explorations with faculty is the gap between their training in their PhD programs and what they actually do in theological schools. Generally, our faculty earn PhD degrees and are taught to do research. And then when they come to teach in a theological school, they have to teach as generalists. They are often deeply involved in the formation of students, for which at least their PhD program didn't prepare them, as well as administrative work. Most faculty, or at least many faculty in our schools these days, are doing at least some level of administrative work. And they have not been prepared to do that. So we need to think about faculty work and rethink. Patterns of educational delivery. The most obvious one is online education, which has been going on for a few years. But it's interesting, in the conversation that we had, I'm not sure if it was the Board of Commissioners or where it was, but talking about the schools that had been approved to offer a comprehensive distance education program. And perhaps they were approved to do that 12 years ago. Well, that world is so different now than it was then. Maybe there needs to be a review and make sure that they're actually doing it the best way possible now. So patterns of educational delivery, location of educational efforts. We'll look in just a minute about residency and what that means. And assessment of learning. So these are some of the educational models and practices, and there are many more, but we're looking at it as broadly as possible. The plan in the project has 4 areas of work. They're numbered a little differently in the brochure that you have. We've combined a couple of different areas. The first area is a comprehensive study of educational program developments in ATS schools. We know what the schools are doing in terms of degree programs, because those are reported in the annual report forms. There's a lot we don't know, though, about what schools are doing in terms of delivery, in terms of reaching particular audiences, in terms of a whole range of activities. And so we want to find out what the schools are doing, and we also want to bring groups of schools together to study particular models and practices, and that's where the peer group comes in. So this first big question we're answering in 2 ways. With a mapping survey, we sent a survey to all the academic deans at ATS schools and got about an 83% response rate. We then followed that up after having asked the academic deans about program directors. We're following that up now with a survey of program directors. And I'll share just a couple of the findings from those. We've gathered voluminous data, and we're just now beginning to do some sorting and interpreting of it. But what are the schools doing? And what are they doing that's effective? And how might we embed that in the work? The other area in this area of work is the peer groups. I've given you a list of the peer groups on a sheet. There are 16 of the groups studying a whole range of educational models and practices. 2 of the groups are studying the Doctor of Ministry program. And as Reggie said, some of you in this room are part of those groups, part of that study. I'll say a little more about those in just a minute. But moving on to some of the other areas of work in the project, and then we'll double back and talk about the peer groups. A second area driven by the question, is this a problem, or are these issues only faced by theological schools? And the answer is obviously not. In higher education as a whole, there are tremendous challenges that are taking place. And so what we want to do is study other graduate professional education and find out what they're learning. I read a study from the American Bar Association that was published a couple of years ago that named challenges in legal education. And as I read that, you could almost go through and plug in theological instead of legal, and the issues are virtually identical. It costs too much, it takes too long, you know, just kind of down the row. People who are being trained are not necessarily, or the faculty are not necessarily engaged in the practices of the law adequately to train people in those practices and so forth. So we'll do that study. Another big question, exactly where are theological graduates serving? So we want to do a snapshot map of the religious workforce. We'll select a representative group of schools and we'll survey them, asking them where a couple of classes of their graduates ended up actually serving in employed ministry settings. And then we'll survey those graduates and ask them a bit about their employers, the kind of educational requirements that the employers have, if there are other kinds of employment in those same organizations, and how effective their training was in preparing them for the work that they're actually doing. So at the very least, we'll get a snapshot of where ATS graduates are going, and think that will be very informing about the kind of preparation we should be thinking about to prepare them for the places they're actually serving. Another question is, how might schools use modest financial support to develop innovative ideas or move things along a bit? Or how might they be served by faculty development grants to help them help their faculty adapt to changing realities? So another thing we'll do later this year, late 2016, yes, if they have been struck by enlightening. Late 2016, early 2017, we'll be submitting requests for proposals to all ATS schools. They can apply for what we're calling innovation grants of up to $50,000 to give them some risk capital, to try some things that they have been wanting to try, or to move something they're already trying a little further down the road. We'll also provide up to $15,000 in faculty development grants to help faculty adapt to some of the challenges that they are facing, develop them. Well, these four areas of work are all pointing toward redevelopment of the standards of accreditation. Dan Ailshire, Executive Director of ATS, has spoken of the most recent revision of the standards in 2010, 2012, that's when they were approved by the biennial meeting, as a sort of patch on the software of accreditation. Accreditation 2.1 rather than version 3. What's needed now is a thoroughgoing reconsideration, redevelopment of the standards that will be informed greatly by all the information, all the learning from this major project, and the work that people in the schools have been doing to think carefully about new models and practices, effectiveness, and how those might be embedded in the standards to serve the schools and also to allow them to fulfill their missions as effectively as possible. Any questions there before we look at a couple of things that we have found, just some glimmers?
Has there been a timeline developed on what year y'all are considering a revision of standards, the actual?
Yeah.
2020, you had 2018 here. Is it?
We've thought about hoping to begin the process in 2018. Okay. It depends on how the project kind of plays itself out. These things always take longer than you imagine when you're sitting and writing a grant proposal and planning big things. But sometime in the 2018-2020 time frame, 2019, the process will get going full bore and would likely take a number of years to complete. Okay. A couple of findings. We asked the academic deans when we surveyed them to take 100% of their student body and tell us whether they were living on or adjacent to campus, local commuter or non-local commuter, and that's as much detail as we gave them. These numbers are the averages of the responses that we received, and I think they are pretty revealing. Only, I guess you can't see that if I do it on my computer screen. About a fourth of the students live either on or adjacent to campus. Another fourth are non-local commuters, and about half are local commuters. Now, how does that reflect your own institution? Or each school would be somewhat different, obviously. I think the point here is all the assumptions that we've made about residential theological education are no longer automatically valid. And the things that we assumed were happening through resident study, many of the students, most of the students, are not residential in the same way that maybe they once were in some places. Yes, please.
So what does non-local commuter mean? What does that mean?
It would, generally, I would assume that they would answer that it's someone who lives outside their city, or outside a 25-mile radius or something like that. I mean,
it's not referring, say, to like someone who just comes to intensive courses, maybe.
it could be.
It could be something like that.
Could be someone who studies primarily online. So those numbers are included in here as well.
Of course, at the deep end, all of them are non-local.
Right. Right.
Well, majority, vast majority.
Great majority would be.
Yeah. And probably would depend on the institution and so forth, where it's located. Okay. One of the things we asked the academic deans was to let us know what was going on in their institutions in these categories. Different course delivery methods, different schedule or calendar modifications that they had tried recently, if they had educational partners with whom they were working, if they were using alternative tuition or fee structures such as block tuition or other things that they had tried, developments, programs to serve particular constituencies, or other curricular innovations. So we gave them an opportunity to just put in whatever they were doing that was not included in these others above. We knew the schools were busy. I will speak for myself, I was astonished at how much almost every school is doing. We had 226 schools respond, and in those 226 schools, there were over 2,500 different things. Now, a lot of them were the same from one school to the other, but some schools were doing 15, 20 of these different things currently. And we asked them also what they were planning to do, and many of them who weren't doing it already were planning to try something else. As I reflect on this, these things range obviously from minor adjustments to major initiatives, but each of them requires some level of development, implementation, and administration. So it may seem like a relatively simple thing, for example, to move to offering evening classes, but we know it's not as simple as it might seem to those high-level administrators who just say, just do it. Not that any of us would ever have done that, but the schools are doing so many of these things. Some of them may be low-hanging fruit, but the cumulative effect is people are exhausted. And it may be that all the different things we're doing keep us from doing the big things for which we need all those resources and all that energy. Maybe we need that energy to do more what Ron Heifetz would call adaptive change, to get around to what we need to be doing. That's a couple of things from the survey of academic deans. Now a couple of things from the survey of program directors. 200 schools responded. We got about 440 different surveys returned from these program directors or other people that were named by their academic dean who should respond to this second round of questions. And what we asked in this second round was not just what are you doing, but why are you doing it? What was the motivation behind doing it? Who were the driving forces making it happen? How effective has it been to this point? How has it impacted your school's financial circumstances? 53 of those 200 named the DMIN program as a context for innovative work. Now, it may be that all of you could say that your DMIN program is doing innovative things. That's fair enough. But out of the whole range of things that these people could have identified, 53 named the DMIN program, their particular DMIN program. We have some at least interesting correlations. Now, that is all these are, just correlations. So take them very lightly, and we'll continue to do more in-depth analysis and study of these things. But just a couple of things I wanted to mention to you, the kinds of things that we're discovering. Those who said that their work with this particular area, the DMIN program, was improving the school's financial picture were those who also were engaged in online engagement, used non-intensive course scheduling, and had engaged in partnerships. So those are the correlations between those who saw that this program was making a positive financial impact on their school. Okay? Those who answered that this program was enhancing student learning tended to be those who used innovations in course delivery and who also were involved in partnerships. So these are correlations. They're not necessarily direct causations, but this is how the things tended to line up. Yes, please.
Could you give an example of non-intensive course scheduling related to this?
Might be online, kind of through a semester, or some other, just some variety that wasn't involved in a 1 week or 2 week face-to-face
Does that
intensive.
include non-cohort?
Could,
Yeah.
sure, sure. But we'll be doing a whole lot more analysis of this and sharing the results with you, and at least raising questions. At this point, we have a whole lot more questions than we have answers, and we're relying on you to give us the answers. So, we asked the program directors what challenges they were facing as they were trying to implement or develop this particular program for which they were responsible. So it's a whole range of different things. What are the challenges that they're running into? Resources came up at the top on almost every innovative program or practice that we were looking at. And in 3 different areas: human resources, financial resources, and for some, technological resources were the biggest challenge to doing what they believed they needed to do. Not too far behind that was a lack of understanding of constituent needs. Hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on that with this snapshot of the workforce that we'll be doing. And also hearing from all of you about your understanding of what your constituents need or asking for. Somewhat surprising to us, inflexibility of faculty and the ATS standards were quite a bit lower on that list of impediments. What you normally hear about, and I don't know if I entirely trust this, actually. I do trust the thing about the standards. I mean, that couldn't be a problem for anybody. But other things we've asked point to intransigence of faculty. So I'm not quite sure how to weigh this. It seems to be in some tension. But on this particular survey of program directors, faculty inflexibility was fairly low on the list, as was the accreditation standards. That did vary, I'll say, between different programs. So for example, schools that were interested in doing competency-based education, for example, pointed to the standards as a challenge. Now, there is a possibility of applying for an experimental program in competency-based education. There actually is one underway at Northwest Baptist Seminary. So I think the standards, at least viewed by many, are much less of an impediment than perhaps they were before 2010 and 2012, with the development in the standards of possibilities of applying for exceptions or experiments. A couple of things about the peer groups. There are 16 of them. As I mentioned, 2 of the groups are studying the Doctor of Ministry, and a total of 11 schools are part of those 2 groups. The peer groups include representatives, as you see on the sheet, from anywhere between 5 to maybe 7 or 8 schools who send representatives to a meeting we had here in February, here in Pittsburgh, to begin their work of studying the particular model or practice that they had been assigned, and those are listed on the sheets you have there. An assumption of that work is that expertise resides in the personnel of the schools themselves. So we want to find out what you know about the DMin and bring that knowledge together and study together about some of these issues related to the DMin and this whole other range of programs and models and practices. Another assumption is that there is greater wisdom in collaboration than there is in any individual school or group of schools. So the peer groups are an attempt to collaborate. And we built these groups with schools across ecclesial families, across sizes and types, and that diversity that is part of ATS. The DMin groups have divided into 5 subcommittees looking at these different issues that you see listed on the slide. Admissions, values, nature and purpose of the degree, teaching and learning culture, and outcomes. So they'll be working over the next year to explore those issues related to the Doctor of Ministry degree. Some of the key questions identified by the groups in this meeting in February have to do with such things as, what's the best understanding of MDiv equivalency, as written in the standards and as practiced in the schools? How appropriate is the requirement of 3 years of post-MDiv experience for admission to the DMin? Does the degree belong? Is it worth it? I think I'd probably get affirmation from this particular group. What is the identity of the degree? How is it different from the MDiv? How is it different from the PhD or from other forms of continuing education? An observation that the program normally includes adults in mid-career and uses andragogical teaching and learning principles. Another question, how to measure the impact of the degree in terms of the formation of the graduate or development of skill or greater effectiveness in ministry. How do you measure that impact down the road? Well, these peer groups, the DMin peer groups, will be interacting with other groups who are working on similar or related topics. So for example, the group working on competency-based education, including the assessment of prior learning, it seems to me might have some to learn from the DMin groups as well as to share with them. Or the duration of the MDiv degree, which can have a direct impact on the admission process to the DMin. Or the group working on online education and formation, as those tools become greater parts of DMin degrees. The groups working on global partnerships, or the programs for Latino, Latina students and the historically black theological schools. One of the interesting things that came out of the meeting of the historically black theological schools is their emphasis on community and also individual instruction. There was such a very strong emphasis among those schools that no student will be allowed to fall between the cracks, but they'll be strongly supported. So I think there can be some interaction. Okay, a couple of other things, and then I'd like to ask you for some input. It strikes me that because of the breadth of administrative and pedagogical work that you do as a Doctor of Ministry Program Director, that you might have some particular insights to contribute to this conversation. Also the fact that your degree connects very directly the schools with congregations, people serving in congregations, in ways that no other of the programs do, naturally at least. So if we work upon this assumption that the expertise is within the membership, what is it that DMin directors can contribute both to the discussion of the DMin, but also to the larger rethinking of theological education as a whole? You have been doing some of the models and practices for a long time that might be able to inform this larger conversation about theological education. So for example, contextual learning, working with students who are already in ministry settings. A lot of schools are discovering that students in the MDiv programs are in those circumstances. The intensive course format, adult learning models that can be instructive, especially as the age of many master's level students has risen in a number of schools. Online components to education, global partnerships. A number of the DMin programs have already developed partnerships with other groups around the world. Support of adjunct faculty, which is a huge issue in theological schools in general, and then assessment of outcomes. Well, thank you all very much. It's been good to be with you this evening, and